cost Felicity Whitmore. Everything would cost Felicity Whitmore, everything she'd spent 15 years building at Skyline Airways. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known as she looked at the young black woman in the faded hoodie and worn sneakers, was that she'd just humiliated the daughter of the man who owned 60% of the airline she worked for. And in exactly 14 minutes, when that man made a single phone call from seat 2 of Felicity's career, her pension and her unshakable belief that she could judge a passenger's worth by their appearance would all come crashing down in spectacular, irreversible fashion. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how one moment of casual cruelty ignited a corporate firestorm that would make national headlines and force an entire industry to confront its ugliest truths, we need to go back to where this day began in a penthouse high above Lake Michigan, where a young woman was preparing for the most important speech of her life while wearing her dead mother's college sweatshirt. The alarm on Zara Kennedy's phone whispered to life at 5:45 in the morning, though she'd been awake for hours watching the sky over Lake Michigan shift from black to deep purple to the particular shade of pink that reminded her of her mother's favorite roses. Sleep had been impossible, not because of nerves about the Stanford AI ethics conference where she'd be delivering the keynote speech in less than 12 hours, but because her mind refused to stop running through the code optimization she'd been working on until 3 in the morning. The algorithm that would allow students in underserved communities to access personalized tutoring through AI models that actually understood context and culture rather than just vocabulary and syntax. Her bedroom was a study in contrasts that would have confused anyone trying to understand who Zara Kennedy actually was beneath the assumptions people made when they looked at her. One wall displayed her achievements in sleek frames. The MIT Excellence in Computer Science Award she'd won at 19, the Forbes 30 Under 30 certificate, the letter from the Gates Foundation praising BridgeLearn's impact on educational equity across 43 countries, the patent documentation for the adaptive learning framework that had pushed her company's valuation past $2.3 billion before her 22nd birthday. The opposite wall told a different story entirely, covered in vintage band posters she'd collected from thrift stores and flea markets during her travels Nirvana and the Smiths, and a rare Erykah Badu print she'd found in a Berlin record shop, alongside photographs of her mother, Dr. Sarah Kennedy, gone 4 years now, lost to cancer, that had ravaged her body but never touched the fierce intelligence in her eyes, or the gentle insistence that wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to lift others up. Zara rolled out of bed and padded across the hardwood floor to her desk where 3 monitors still glowed with the cascading lines of code she'd been debugging the latest build of BridgeLearn's emotional intelligence module that would help the AI recognize when a student was frustrated versus confused versus completely lost and adjust its teaching approach accordingly. She'd started this company when she was 19, sitting in this very room, angry and heartbroken, after watching her mother's brilliant mind trapped in a failing body, channeling that rage and grief into something that might help other people's children access the kind of education that shouldn't depend on zip codes or bank accounts or the color of your skin. The tech press had called her a prodigy, a visionary, the future of ethical AI, but they'd done it carefully, keeping her name and face mostly out of their coverage at her insistence. Because Zara had learned early and painfully that the moment people knew she was young and black and female and rich, the conversation shifted from what she'd built to how she couldn't possibly have built it, from her ideas to her appearance, from substance to spectacle. She pulled on the Northwestern hoodie that had belonged to her mother during her undergraduate years. The purple fabric faded and soft from decades of washing, the hem frayed, but precious. Then stepped into jeans she'd bought at a Goodwill in Oakland 2 years ago because they fit perfectly, and she didn't believe in spending $300 on denim just because some designer's name was stitched into the pocket. Her Converse sneakers, scuffed and comfortable, completed the outfit that would cause so much trouble in just a few hours, though she had no way of knowing that as she twisted her natural hair into 2 simple braids and studied her reflection in the mirror. Seeing her mother's eyes looking back at her, dark and determined and tired from too many late nights trying to change the world through ones and zeros. The apartment around her was worth $12 million a penthouse her father had purchased after her mother died, unable to stay in the house where every room whispered memories of the woman they'd both loved. But Zara had claimed this bedroom specifically because it was the smallest, the least ostentatious, the one that felt like a space she'd actually chosen rather than inherited. She grabbed her canvas backpack, the one she'd picked up at a flea market in Berlin during a tech conference, and loaded it with her laptop. Her presentation notes saved on 3 separate USB drives because she trusted nothing to the cloud when it mattered this much. Chargers and cables and the small stuffed penguin her mother had given her before the first day of kindergarten that still traveled with her to every important event as a talisman against the world's cruelty. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Breakfast in 10 minutes. Sparrow and don't tell me you're not hungry because I can hear your stomach growling from the kitchen." She smiled at the childhood nickname he'd never outgrown, the name her mother had given her after watching infant Zara's eyes dart around constantly, absorbing everything, quick and curious, and unable to stay still, and made her way down the hall toward the scent of coffee and her father's terrible attempt at making pancakes that would somehow still taste perfect because he'd made them with love. Victor Kennedy stood at the stove in the penthouse's commercial-grade kitchen spatula in hand, wearing the reading glasses he pretended not to need, and an MIT sweatshirt that matched his daughter's Northwestern one in spirit, if not in color. Both of them preferring the comfortable weight of old cotton to the crisp formality of designer labels, even though they could afford to buy out entire boutiques without checking the price tags. At 52, Victor had built Apex Global Holdings from nothing, starting with a single regional airline he'd purchased for pennies on the dollar during the 2008 financial crisis, and transforming it into a conglomerate that now controlled 60% of domestic regional air traffic. But the business magazines that profiled him always seemed surprised that a black man could accumulate that kind of power, always looked for the trick or the luck or the unfair advantage rather than acknowledging the brutal intelligence and relentless work ethic that had carried him from the south side of Chicago to the top of an industry that had tried to keep people who looked like him in the back of the plane or off the plane entirely. He looked up as Zara entered, and his face did that thing it always did when he saw her, a softening around the eyes that suggested he was seeing both his daughter and his late wife. The 2 women who'd taught him that wealth was a tool and power was a responsibility, and success meant nothing if you achieved it by stepping on the people behind you. "Your presentation is going to change lives today," Victor said, sliding a plate of slightly burnt pancakes across the marble counter, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon mixing with the coffee that was probably strong enough to strip paint exactly how they both liked it. Those Stanford professors don't know what's about to hit them. Zara accepted the plate and drowned the pancakes in syrup. Hunger finally catching up with her after the all-nighter, and for a few minutes they ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've survived grief together and come out the other side knowing that words aren't always necessary to communicate love. "Dad, you know you don't have to fly out with me," Zara said eventually, though she already knew it was a losing battle, because Victor Kennedy had many talents, but letting his daughter navigate the world without backup wasn't one of them. "I'm 21. I've flown alone 100 times, and I'm pretty sure I can handle a 3-hour flight without adult supervision." Victor smiled into his coffee, that particular smile that meant he was about to pull rank in the gentlest possible way. "I have meetings in San Francisco anyway." He lied smoothly, and they both knew it was a lie. But Zara also knew that arguing would be pointless because her father had spent the 4 years since her mother's death trying to make up for the fact that he couldn't protect Sarah from cancer. And if that meant being overprotective of their daughter, then that was a small price to pay for the fierce love that drove it. "Fine, but I'm flying," Coach Zara insisted, a familiar argument they'd had dozens of times. her belief that she did her best thinking in the cramped quarters of economy seating where nobody expected anything from her, and she could disappear into her work versus his desire to wrap her in the comfort and safety of first-class cocoons where the world treated you like you mattered. "Your choice," Sparrow Victor said, which meant he'd already arranged for a courtesy upgrade that she wouldn't know about until she checked in a little game they played where he tried to take care of her and she tried to stay grounded, both of them honoring Sarah's memory in their own ways. They finished breakfast discussing the finer points of Zara's keynote, her argument that AI ethics couldn't be an afterthought or a PR strategy, but had to be baked into the fundamental architecture of how we built thinking machines. And Victor listened with the complete attention he'd always given to his daughter's passions, asking questions that showed he understood not just what she was saying, but why it mattered. Why she'd spent 3 years building BridgeLearn instead of taking the Silicon Valley route of moving fast and breaking things and collecting billions while leaving the broken pieces for someone else to clean up. At 7:45, they gathered their bags, Victor in his impeccable Navy suit, with his first-class boarding pass already loaded on his phone. Zara in her hoodie and jeans with her printed backup pass tucked into her backpack, because she never fully trusted technology, not to fail at the worst possible moment. A paranoia that was about to prove prophetic in ways neither of them could anticipate. "If anyone gives you trouble," Victor started as they headed toward the elevator, the beginning of a familiar refrain. But Zara cut him off with a laugh that sounded so much like her mother's it made his heart ache. "I'll handle it, Dad. I always do," she said. And she meant it because she'd spent her entire life handling the assumptions and the dismissals and the casual cruelty of people who looked at her and saw everything, except who she actually was. And she'd learned to navigate that minefield with the same grace her mother had taught her, the quiet dignity that refused to shrink or apologize or perform gratitude for basic human respect. What neither of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have known as they rode down 43 floors in comfortable silence, was that today would be different. That today, Zara wouldn't have to handle it alone. And that the person who would refuse to see her humanity was about to discover exactly how much power the invisible can wield when they finally decide to become visible. O'Hare. International Airport's Terminal 1 was drowning in the particular chaos that happens when 3 delayed flights converge with morning rush hour and a weather system that's threatening to shut down half the Midwest, before noon creating a perfect storm of stressed travelers, crying children, and gate agents who'd stopped pretending to care about customer service somewhere around their 3rd consecutive double shift. Zara Kennedy navigated through the human traffic with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent the better part of 3 years flying between tech conferences and investor meetings and university speaking engagements. Her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes scanning for Gate C-14, while her mind was still half-focused on the presentation she'd be delivering in less than 6 hours, the slides she'd refined 17 times, because every word mattered when you were trying to convince a room full of skeptics that ethics and profit weren't mutually exclusive concepts. She'd arrived at the airport separately from her father, both of them preferring the quiet solitude of their own thoughts during the pre-flight ritual, planning to meet at the gate. Or maybe not at all, since Victor would be in first class, and she'd be back in economy, 30 rows of airplanes separating them, but connected by the invisible thread of shared DNA and shared grief and shared determination to make Sarah's memory mean something more than flowers on a grave. The gate area, when she finally found it after following the confusing signage that seemed designed to get travelers lost, was a study in airline class hierarchy, made physical and impossible to ignore. 3 distinct lanes stretched out from the podium where gate agents processed boarding passes. The economy line, a writhing mass of humanity that snaked back 20 rows deep, full of families juggling car seats and strollers, and that desperate exhaustion that comes from trying to travel on a budget. The premium line, moderately populated with business travelers in their Brooks Brothers armor checking phones and looking irritated that they had to wait at all. and the Diamond Priority Lane, a red-carpeted stretch of empty space reserved for the anointed few who'd accumulated enough miles or money to access the airline's highest tier of service, currently occupied by exactly 0 passengers. Zara took in this geography of privilege and made the calculation she always made joining the economy line because that's what her boarding pass said. Seat 34, B Group 4, the back of the plane where the bathrooms were, and the overhead bins were always full, and nobody expected you to be anybody important. She pulled out her phone to double-check her confirmation earbuds in her playlist, shuffling between Kendrick Lamar and Chopin, because she'd never understood why people thought you had to choose between hip-hop and classical when both understood something fundamental about the human condition. And that's when she noticed her phone battery hovering at 3%, the consequence of staying up all night coding and forgetting to plug in before she left the apartment. Behind the gate counter, Felicity Whitmore was holding court in her kingdom of judgment and arbitrary power. Platinum blonde hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful, her Navy Skyline Airways uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, her makeup applied with the careful expertise of someone who believed that presentation was everything, and substance was for people who couldn't afford better packaging. At 45, Felicity had been working gates at O'Hare for 15 years, long enough to develop a comprehensive taxonomy of passengers, based on appearance and attitude, long enough to believe she could spot the frauds and the chancers and the people trying to sneak into spaces they hadn't earned, long enough to forget if she'd ever known that a boarding pass was supposed to be the only credential that mattered. She was currently on her personal cell phone, loud enough for everyone in the gate area to hear complaining to someone about these people who thought showing up at an airport entitled them to special treatment, her acrylic French-tipped nails clicking against the phone case as she rolled her eyes at some story her friend was telling, completely ignoring the line of actual passengers who'd been waiting for her attention for the better part of 5 minutes. 2 other gate agents flanked her workspace Trevor, who looked about 23 and, terrified, clearly knew enough that he still believed the employee handbook's promises about treating every passenger with respect, and Candace, mid-50s and worn down by a decade and a half of watching people like Felicity turn customer service into customer punishment, her eyes holding that particular resignation of someone who'd tried to fight the culture and lost too many times to keep trying. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers. The gate agent's voice, flat and mechanical as it called for Diamond Priority passengers to begin boarding, and Felicity snapped to attention like a soldier, hearing her commander's voice ending her personal call mid-sentence and transforming her expression from bored contempt to syrupy service industry sweetness in the space of a heartbeat. A businessman in an Armani suit materialized at the Diamond Lane, barely breaking stride, as he approached the counter, and Felicity practically glowed with the reflected status of serving someone who looked like money scanning his boarding pass, with a deferential smile that never reached her eyes, but communicated everything about the hierarchy she believed in and enforced with the petty tyranny available to low-level gatekeepers everywhere. "Mr. Pattison, wonderful to see you again." Felicity cooed, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial warmth that made Zara's skin crawl even from 30 feet away in the economy line, and the businessman grunted something that might have been acknowledgement before disappearing down the jet bridge without so much as a thank you, because people who are used to being treated well often forget to notice the people doing the treating. Zara checked her phone again and watched helplessly as the battery percentage dropped to 2%. Then 1%, the device apparently determined to die at the least convenient moment possible, and she made a mental note to pull out her printed boarding pass before the phone gave up entirely. She glanced toward the premium line and spotted her father several rows back, his silver hair and commanding presence making him impossible to miss even in a crowd. And he caught her eye and gave a small wave, the gesture of a man who wanted to rush over and make sure she was okay, but who also understood that his 21-year-old daughter didn't need or want public displays of paternal hovering. What Zara didn't know what she couldn't have known, because her phone was now officially dead and dark in her hand, was that sometime during the night, Victor's assistant had quietly processed a courtesy upgrade, moving her from seat 34B in the back of economy to seat 3C in the first-class cabin, a small gesture of paternal love disguised as corporate efficiency, and that upgrade notification was sitting unread in her email, inaccessible now that her phone had finally surrendered to its battery death. She dug through her backpack and found the printed boarding pass she'd prepared the night before, a backup from a more paranoid time when she didn't fully trust digital everything, and the paper still showed her original seat assignment. 34B Group 4. The information she'd loaded into her brain and hadn't thought to double-check, because why would you when you'd booked the ticket yourself and knew exactly where you'd chosen to sit? The economy line crept forward with the speed of continental drift, and Zara watched Felicity interact with the passengers ahead of her, noting the way the gate agent's warmth and efficiency seemed directly correlated to the passengers' apparent wealth and status. All smiles for the woman with the Burberry carry-on. All cold efficiency for the older Latina woman struggling with 3 bags and a thick accent who Felicity berated for not following the baggage guidelines, even though the woman's bags were clearly within the size limits posted on every sign in the terminal. The Latina woman's face flushed with humiliation as she reorganized her belongings under Felicity's impatient glare and the judgmental stares of passengers behind her who just wanted the line to move, and Zara felt her jaw tighten with recognition, because she'd seen this movie before, had starred in variations of it in venture capital meetings where people assumed she was someone's assistant in academic conferences, where professors asked if she was lost on her way to the undergraduate fair, in 1,000 small moments, where the world looked at her and saw everything except her actual credentials and capabilities and worth. The Latina woman finally shuffled away from the counter, dignity bruised but intact, and Zara stepped forward to take her place, pulling out her printed boarding pass and preparing for the transaction that should have been simple and mechanical and completely unremarkable, but was about to become the catalyst for everything that followed. Felicity Whitmore was typing something into her computer with the focused intensity of someone who believed that whatever she was working on was significantly more important than the human being standing directly in front of her, waiting for service, her French-tipped nails clicking against the keyboard in a rhythm that suggested both speed and irritation, as if the very act of having to help passengers was an unwelcome interruption to the real work of whatever administrative task currently consumed her attention. Zara stood at the counter for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15, watching Felicity's face remain locked on her screen. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement that another person had entered her sphere of awareness, and the silence stretched out with that particular awkwardness that comes from being deliberately ignored while also being unable to leave, because you need something from the person doing the ignoring. "Excuse me," Zara said, finally, her voice polite but firm, the tone of someone who'd learned to advocate for herself without aggression, because aggression from people who looked like her was always read as threat rather than assertion. "I'd like to check in for flight 447 to San Francisco." Felicity held up one finger without looking away from her computer screen, a gesture that managed to be both dismissive and commanding, the universal signal for wait, because what I'm doing is more important than what you need. And Zara watched that finger hang in the air between them like a punctuation mark, ending a sentence she hadn't been allowed to finish. 30 seconds passed, then 45, and Felicity reached for her Starbucks cup, took a leisurely sip, set it down with the kind of deliberate slowness that communicated contempt more effectively than words ever could, and still didn't make eye contact with the young woman waiting at her counter. Zara felt the familiar heat beginning to build in her chest, that toxic mixture of frustration and humiliation and anger that came from being treated as invisible. But she held her tongue and her temper because her mother had taught her that dignity was something you maintained regardless of how others tried to strip it away. And losing your composure only gave people permission to dismiss your legitimate grievances as emotional overreaction. Behind her in the economy line, Zara could hear the growing restlessness of other passengers, the shuffling feet and irritated sighs of people who'd been waiting too long, and wanted the line to move their frustration bleeding into the air around them, but not quite directed at Felicity, because gate agents existed in a weird liminal space of authority where attacking them directly might get you kicked off your flight, so instead, the irritation just hung there, ambient and acidic, making everything worse. Finally, mercifully, Felicity looked up from her computer, and her eyes did exactly what Zara had known they would do, had seen them do 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts. They traveled from Zara's face down to her northwestern hoodie, lingered on the faded purple fabric that had been her mother's, continued down to her worn jeans and her scuffed Converse sneakers, then traveled back up with an expression that managed to communicate assessment judgment and dismissal in the span of perhaps 2 seconds, a masterclass in nonverbal contempt that was probably taught in some secret curriculum for people who believed their job was to enforce hierarchies rather than provide service. Boarding pass. Felicity set her voice flat and bored, stripped of any warmth or courtesy, just 2 words delivered with the minimum effort required to technically qualify as communication. Zara handed over her printed pass, the paper slightly crumpled from being stuffed into her backpack, and watched as Felicity took it between 2 fingers, as if it might be contaminated, glancing at it with the kind of cursory attention you'd give to junk mail before throwing it away. "This says Seat 3C. Felicity observed her tone sharpening with something that sounded almost like satisfaction, as if she'd just confirmed a suspicion she'd been harboring. "That's first class." The way she said first class made it sound like an accusation, like Zara had claimed to be royalty, or a Nobel Prize winner, something so obviously fraudulent that it barely merited discussion. "Yes," Zara said carefully, confused about why this was even a conversation. "I was upgraded, apparently." But Felicity cut her off before she could finish the sentence, her voice rising slightly with the confidence of someone who believed she'd caught a scammer in the act. Upgraded from what seat originally, Felicity demanded, and there was an edge to her voice now, a prosecutorial sharpness that suggested this was an interrogation rather than a customer service interaction. "Seat 34. Zara answered, pulling the information from memory since her dead phone couldn't confirm it. "But the pass shows 3C, so—" And again, Felicity interrupted, leaning forward slightly with the body language of someone delivering a verdict. "Right, so you're actually an economy passenger trying to use an invalid upgrade?" she said, her words clipped and certain as if this conclusion was self-evident and required no further investigation. Zara blinked momentarily, thrown by the sheer confidence with which Felicity had declared her boarding pass invalid without actually checking anything beyond the piece of paper in her hand, and she felt that familiar sinking sensation that came from realizing a simple transaction was about to become a battle she'd have to fight just to access something she'd legitimately paid for. Invalid Zara repeated, keeping her voice level despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath her carefully maintained composure. "It's printed right there on my boarding pass, Seat 3C. It should be in your system, but once again—" Felicity cut through her words like they were irrelevant noise. "Sweetie," Felicity said, and the condescension dripping from that single word was thick enough to choke on these upgrade codes, "have to be confirmed at the gate, and I'm looking at the manifest right now." She tapped her computer screen for emphasis, though she hadn't actually looked at it in the past 30 seconds, and Seat 3C is assigned to a Mr. Caldwell who's already boarded the aircraft. The implication hung in the air unspoken but crystal clear. You're either lying or confused, and either way, you don't belong in first class. Zara's hands tightened on the straps of her backpack, a physical tell of the stress flooding her nervous system, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and speak calmly, because raising her voice or showing anger would only confirm whatever narrative Felicity had already constructed about who she was and why she was trying to scam her way into premium seating. "Can you check again, please?" Zara asked, injecting as much patience into her voice as she could manufacture. "The name should be Kennedy Zara Kennedy, and if there's been some kind of mix-up with the seat assignments, I'd appreciate your help sorting it out." It was a reasonable request, politely phrased exactly the kind of thing that should have prompted a gate agent to spend 30 seconds verifying information in the computer system. But Felicity didn't even pretend to check, didn't touch her keyboard or glance at her screen. Just looked at Zara with an expression that suggested she was dealing with a particularly slow child who needed things explained in very simple terms. "Look, honey," Felicity said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that was somehow louder than her normal speaking voice, loud enough that passengers in the nearby lines could definitely hear her. "Between you and me, these upgrades don't just happen for coach passengers, okay? First class is for people who, well, it's for our premium customers, you understand?" The coded language wasn't even subtle. Wasn't even trying to disguise itself as anything other than what it was. And Zara felt something shift inside her chest, a kind of cold clarity that comes from recognizing that this wasn't going to be resolved through politeness or patience, that Felicity had already decided who Zara was based on. Nothing more than her appearance, and no amount of reasonable discussion was going to change a mind that had already closed. "Premium customers who look the part, you mean?" Zara said quietly, her voice steady but her words sharp enough to cut through Felicity's pretense, forcing the subtext into text, making the invisible bias visible and speakable. Felicity's mask of customer service sweetness cracked slightly, irritation flashing across her face like lightning before she caught herself and reconstructed the facade, but the damage was done. The truth had been spoken, and they both knew exactly what conversation they were really having beneath the surface discussion about boarding passes and seat assignments. "I mean people who actually paid for first class." Felicity snapped, her voice losing its artificial warmth and revealing the cold contempt underneath. "Now I can get you on the plane in your actual seat 34B, but you need to wait for Economy Boarding Group 4, which hasn't been called yet. You're holding up the line, and I have premium passengers who need my attention." She gestured vaguely toward the empty Diamond Priority lane, as if invisible VIPs were waiting impatiently for service, and Zara followed her gesture to confirm what she already knew. There was nobody there, no premium passengers being inconvenienced, just Felicity's need to reassert the hierarchy that Zara had dared to question. Behind Zara, the businessman in the Brooks Brothers suit sighed loudly and checked his watch with theatrical impatience, performing frustration for an audience of strangers. And somewhere further back in line, a woman with a Chanel purse muttered something to her husband that Zara couldn't quite hear but could easily imagine, because she'd heard variations of those mutters her entire life, the casual cruelty of people who believed their time was more valuable than someone else's dignity. But not everyone in the gate area was complicit in the performance unfolding at Felicity's counter, and Zara noticed a young black woman, about her own age college student, based on the Howard University hoodie she wore, watching the interaction with her phone held at an angle that suggested she was documenting this moment for reasons Zara couldn't yet understand, but would soon be grateful for. Trevor, the young gate agent, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, stepped closer to Felicity and whispered something that Zara couldn't hear his body language, suggesting discomfort with how his colleague was handling the situation. But Felicity's response was loud enough to carry across the counter Trevor. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know a fake upgrade when I see one, so why don't you go help with the family in Zone 7 and let me handle this?" Trevor hesitated for a moment, looking at Zara with something that might have been an apology in his eyes, then retreated as ordered, clearly not senior enough or brave enough to challenge Felicity's authority in front of passengers. Felicity turned back to Zara with an expression of grim satisfaction, someone who'd successfully defended her territory against an interloper and delivered her ultimatum with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Final warning, sweetie. Step aside and wait for your group to be called, or I'm calling airport police for disrupting the boarding process." The threat hung in the air between them, and Zara felt the weight of all the decisions that had led to this moment, all the times she'd walked away from confrontations like this because fighting back seemed more trouble than it was worth. all the indignities she'd swallowed because calling them out would make her the problem rather than the person with the problem. But something about Felicity's absolute certainty, her unshakable belief that she had the right to humiliate someone based on nothing more than assumptions about their worth, made Zara plant her feet and straighten her spine and look directly into the gate agent's eyes as she spoke the words that would set everything else in motion. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." Zara said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that her mother would have recognized the tone Sarah Kennedy had used when doctors tried to rush her through appointments, or when school administrators tried to suggest that perhaps gifted programs weren't the right fit for her daughter. The voice of a woman who knew her value and refused to accept less than the respect she deserved. Felicity's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise that someone was actually challenging her authority, anger that her judgment was being questioned, and finally a kind of vindictive pleasure at the opportunity to escalate the situation to its logical conclusion because supervisors didn't override gate agents' decisions. Supervisors backed them up, and calling for management was just going to make this young woman's humiliation that much more official and that much more public. "Oh, here we go," Felicity said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, sharp and brittle and designed to cut. "Let me guess you want to speak to the manager." The mockery in her voice was unmistakable, invoking every entitled customer stereotype trying to shame Zara for daring to assert her rights. But Zara didn't flinch, didn't back down, just stood there with quiet dignity while Felicity picked up the phone and made the call that would, though neither of them knew it yet, end several careers before the sun set on this particular Tuesday in Chicago. Paul Grantham arrived at Gate C-14 approximately 4 minutes after Felicity's call, moving with the brisk, self-important stride of a middle manager who'd spent 18 years convincing himself that supervising airline gate operations was somehow equivalent to running a small nation-state, that his decisions about boarding groups and seat assignments carried the weight of geopolitical significance, rather than the mundane reality of moving human bodies from point A to point B on a predetermined schedule. At 58, Paul had the look of a man who'd peaked early and spent the subsequent decades trying to maintain the illusion of authority through increasingly rigid adherence to rules and procedures. His graying temples and expensive Tag Heuer watch suggesting success, while his exhausted eyes and slight paunch revealed the truth of too many years standing in fluorescent-lit terminals dealing with what he privately called the great unwashed masses, who thought buying a plane ticket entitled them to basic human courtesy. He wore his Skyline Airways supervisor badge like a sheriff's star displayed prominently on his navy blazer, and his wedding ring caught the overhead lights as he approached Felicity's counter with the weary certainty of a man who'd resolved 1,000 difficult passenger situations and expected this one to follow the same script. Identify the troublemaker, employ just enough corporate speak to seem reasonable, threaten consequences if they didn't comply, move on to the next crisis. Felicity immediately shifted into performance mode the moment Paul came into view, her body language transforming from defensive irritation to put-upon victim, her voice taking on that particular tone of someone who'd been trying so very hard to help but had been thwarted by an unreasonable customer's refusal to accept reality. "Paul, thank God you're here," she said, loud enough that nearby passengers would hear and understand that she was the reasonable party in this dispute, that she'd exhausted all her options before calling for backup. "This passenger is claiming she has a first-class upgrade, but the system shows no such thing, and she's refusing to board in her actual seat and threatening me when I try to explain the policy." The way Felicity delivered this summary, it sounded like Zara had been screaming and throwing things, rather than simply asking for someone to scan a barcode and verify information. But lies of omission are still lies, and the passengers who hadn't been paying attention to the earlier interaction now looked at Zara with that mixture of curiosity and judgment that comes from hearing only one side of a story. Paul didn't even glance at Zara, initially directing his first question to Felicity, as if the passenger herself was merely a prop in a conversation between airline employees rather than the actual human being at the center of the dispute. "Did you offer to rebook her?" Paul asked, his voice carrying the tired patience of someone going through a mental checklist, and Felicity nodded vigorously, her performance continuing. "I tried to help her. Paul, I really did, but she became belligerent and started accusing me of—" She paused dramatically, as if the accusation was too terrible to voice of discrimination, just because I was following our standard verification protocols for questionable upgrades. The word belligerent landed like a stone thrown into water, ripples of assumption spreading outward because everyone knew what belligerent meant when applied to young black women in customer service contexts, the coded language that transformed reasonable assertion into threatening aggression, that turned standing your ground into causing a scene. Now Paul turned his attention to Zara, and his eyes performed the same rapid assessment that Felicity's had earlier, scanning her appearance from head to toe, taking in the Northwestern hoodie and jeans and canvas backpack. And Zara watched his expression shift from neutral professional concern to something harder and colder, that particular look that said he'd already decided what kind of person she was and what kind of situation this represented before she'd even opened her mouth to defend herself. "Miss, what seems to be the problem?" Paul asked, his voice carrying just enough courtesy to sound reasonable to anyone listening, while the tone underneath communicated that he'd already sided with his employee, and this was merely the performance of fairness rather than the reality of it. Zara took a slow breath, steadying herself against the urge to match his condescension with anger, because she'd played this game enough times to know that showing emotion would only confirm whatever narrative they'd already constructed, that her best weapon was the same dignified calm her mother had wielded like a shield against the world's countless small cruelties. "I have a boarding pass that shows seat 3C in first class," Zara explained, keeping her voice measured and factual, presenting the situation as a simple problem with a simple solution. "My phone died, so I can't pull up the digital confirmation right now. But this printed pass should be in your system, and I'm asking someone to please scan the barcode and verify the seat assignment instead of assuming it's fraudulent without checking." It was a reasonable request, delivered reasonably, exactly the kind of thing that should have prompted Paul to spend 30 seconds looking at a computer screen, but instead he took the printed boarding pass from her hand and examined it the way a forensics investigator might study evidence of a crime, holding it up to the light, as if checking for watermarks or signs of forgery. His performance of skepticism designed to undermine her credibility before he'd even attempted to verify her claim. "This could be printed by anyone," Paul said, his voice heavy with implication. "Where did you get this particular document?" The question was absurd on its face, treating a boarding pass like it was classified intelligence rather than a routine travel document. But Zara recognized the trap being set the way her answer would be used to construct a narrative of fraud, regardless of what she actually said. "From the Skyline Airways app last night," she answered, maintaining her patience through sheer force of will. "I printed it as a backup in case," but Paul cut her off mid-sentence, seizing on a detail that seemed to confirm his predetermined conclusion. "But you just said your phone is dead." He interjected, his tone suggesting he'd caught her in a contradiction. "So how do you know what the app says if you can't access it?" Zara felt the conversation sliding sideways into absurdity, the logic becoming deliberately circular, designed not to arrive at truth but to exhaust her patience and make her give up out of frustration. "My phone died this morning," she explained, speaking slowly and clearly as if to a child. "I printed this backup last night when my phone was working, which is why I have a physical copy." "So you have no digital confirmation?" Paul interrupted again, not even pretending to listen to her explanation, just waiting for her to stop talking so he could deliver his next predetermined line. "Just this piece of paper that could have come from anywhere." Behind Paul, Trevor had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort, and he finally worked up the courage to interject his young voice, uncertain but trying to be helpful. "Sir, I could look her up in the system by name." Trevor suggested, gesturing toward his computer terminal. If she's in the manifest for 3C, it'll show. But Paul whirled on the younger agent with a sharpness that made Trevor actually flinch, clearly not used to being on the receiving end of his supervisor's contempt. Trevor, I didn't ask for your input, Paul snapped. Go help with the family in row 7 and let me handle this situation. Trevor hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at Zara with something that might have been sympathy or might have been guilt, then retreated toward the jet bridge as ordered. Another potential ally removed from the field, leaving Zara alone to face Paul's combination of institutional authority and personal prejudice. Paul crossed his arms across his chest, a posture that communicated judgment and finality, and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. The kind of explanation he'd probably given dozens of times to passengers he'd decided were trying to cheat the system. Miss, I'm going to be straight with you. He began, his voice taking on that false reasonableness that people use when they're about to say something deeply unreasonable. We have a serious problem with upgrade fraud on this route. People using Photoshop to create fake confirmation codes trying to sneak into premium cabins they haven't paid for. And it's gotten so bad that corporate sent out a directive requiring us to verify all questionable upgrades with photo ID and the credit card used for the original purchase. Zara reached for her wallet, hoping that producing identification might somehow break through the wall of assumption that had been built around her pulling out her driver's license and holding it toward Paul. I can show you my ID, she offered. But Paul wasn't finished with his explanation, wasn't ready to be derailed by the possibility that she might actually have the documentation he was claiming to require, and the credit card. Paul continued, knowing somehow that this would be the trap, the requirement she couldn't meet because the upgrade had been arranged by her father's assistant as a courtesy, not purchased directly by Zara herself. She hesitated just for a moment, trying to figure out how to explain that her seat had been upgraded through legitimate channels that didn't involve her personally swiping a credit card. But that hesitation was all Paul needed to see that fraction of a second where she couldn't immediately produce the exact documentation he'd demanded, and his expression shifted from false concern to something like triumph, the look of someone who'd just confirmed what he already knew. That's what I thought, Paul said, his voice dripping with vindication. You didn't pay for this upgrade, did you? This is exactly the kind of fraud I'm talking about. Zara felt the situation spiraling beyond her control, felt the weight of all the assumptions being made and the impossibility of defending herself against accusations that weren't really about boarding passes or credit cards, but about something much deeper and more toxic that neither Paul nor Felicity would ever admit out loud. It was a courtesy upgrade, Zara said carefully, trying to explain without sounding like she was making excuses or name-dropping, walking the impossible line between defending herself and seeming entitled. But that doesn't make it fraudulent, and if you would just scan the barcode or check the system under my name, Kennedy Zara Kennedy, you'd see. But Paul cut her off. Again, his patience clearly exhausted now that he'd satisfied himself that she was indeed trying to scam her way into first class. From whom, he demanded. Who exactly provided this courtesy upgrade? It was another trap, Zara realized, because if she said my father, it would sound like she was claiming special privileges. And if she explained who her father actually was, it would seem like she was trying to use his status to intimidate Paul into backing down, and either way she'd be confirming some narrative about entitled passengers who thought the rules didn't apply to them. She chose dignity over explanation, her mother's voice in her head reminding her that she didn't owe these people her life story, just to justify her right to board a plane she had a legitimate ticket for. That's not relevant, Zara said quietly but firmly, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from knowing your rights, even when the people with power are trying to convince you that you don't have any. The boarding pass is legitimate. It came through the Skyline Airways system, and you can verify it by looking at your computer instead of making assumptions about what I can or can't afford. The word assumptions hung in the air like smoke, making visible the unspoken dynamics of class and race and appearance that had driven this entire interaction from the moment Felicity first looked at Zara's hoodie and decided she didn't belong in first class, and Paul's face darkened with something that looked like anger but might have been embarrassment at having his prejudice named so directly. "I don't need to verify anything," Paul said, his voice rising slightly loud enough now that passengers throughout the gate area were openly watching the confrontation unfold. "What I need is for you to stop disrupting my boarding process and get in the correct line for your actual seat assignment." The young woman in the Howard University hoodie, the one who'd been recording earlier, stepped forward from her place in the economy line, her voice clear and strong despite the nervousness Zara could see in her shaking hands. "Excuse me, sir," the student said, addressing Paul directly. "I saw the whole thing from the beginning, and she didn't do anything wrong. She just asked to have her pass scanned. She wasn't disruptive or rude or anything you're claiming." Paul rounded on this new voice with the fury of someone who couldn't tolerate being challenged by passengers, his authority threatened by the mere suggestion that he might not be handling the situation correctly. "Are you a Skyline employee?" Paul demanded, his voice sharp as a knife. The student straightened her spine, clearly intimidated but refusing to back down. "No, but I'm a witness and I'm recording this interaction, and I think you should know that." But Paul cut her off before she could finish, his voice rising to something close to a shout. "Put that phone away immediately," Paul commanded, pointing at the device in the student's hand. "You're in violation of Skyline Airways photography policy in secured gate areas, and if you don't stop recording right now, you'll be removed from this flight as well." The student, whose name was Imani, though Zara wouldn't learn this until later, lowered her phone to her side, but didn't turn off the camera, still capturing audio. Even if the video was now just pointed at the floor, documenting this confrontation for posterity and for the Twitter feed, where she'd already uploaded the earlier footage and where the view count was climbing toward 50,000, while Paul remained blissfully unaware that his career was being live-streamed to thousands of strangers who were forming very strong opinions about his customer service skills. Paul keyed his radio, the device crackling to life with the self-importance of someone calling for backup, his voice taking on an official tone as he spoke into the receiver. "Security, this is Gate C-14. I need 2 officers for a passenger refusing to comply with boarding procedures and creating a disturbance, possible trespass situation." Zara felt her stomach drop at those words. Trespass situation. The transformation of her legitimate presence at a gate where she had every right to be into something criminal, something that justified the arrival of armed security officers. Who would see a young black woman being accused of wrongdoing by authority figures and would make their own assumptions about who deserved their protection and who deserved their suspicion? She'd seen this script play out before, not to her personally, but to others had watched the videos that went viral of people being dragged off planes or arrested at gates for the crime of asserting their rights while being insufficiently deferential to the people in uniform. And she knew with terrible certainty that the arrival of security would escalate this situation beyond her ability to control it. That once the officers appeared, the narrative would calcify into passenger versus airline, and she would be presumed guilty unless she could prove her innocence beyond any shadow of doubt. "I'm not refusing to comply with anything Zara said." Her voice still calm, but edged now with the kind of fear that comes from recognizing real danger. "I'm asking you to scan my boarding pass and verify my seat assignment, which is a reasonable request that you're refusing to fulfill." "You're refusing to board in your assigned seat," Paul countered his logic. Circular and impenetrable, treating her request for verification as itself a refusal to comply, creating a catch-22, where the only way to not be considered disruptive was to accept his authority without question and retreat to whatever space he'd decided she belonged in. "That's disruption, and now you've involved another passenger." He gestured toward Imani, who was still standing with her phone at her side, still recording and creating a disturbance that's delaying this flight and inconveniencing hundreds of other travelers who just want to get to San Francisco on time. It was a masterful reframing, Zara had to admit, even through her rising panic transforming himself and Felicity from the sources of the delay into its victims. making Zara the person responsible for everyone else's inconvenience rather than the gate agents who'd refused to spend 30 seconds checking a computer system. And she could see from the faces of the other passengers that some of them were buying it, were looking at her with irritation and impatience, wanting her to just give up and sit down so the line could move and they could all get on with their lives. 2 security officers materialized from the crowd with that particular authority that comes from wearing a uniform and carrying a badge, 1 male and 1 female, both white and both wearing expressions of professional boredom that suggested they'd been called to gates for passenger disputes more times than they could count, and expected this to be just another routine removal of someone who'd gotten too uppity with airline staff. The male officer, thick-necked and radiating the kind of physical presence designed to intimidate without actively threatening, addressed Paul first, rather than Zara, the hierarchy of whose story mattered already established before anyone had explained the situation. "What's the situation here?" the officer asked Paul, and Zara noticed the way his hand rested casually on his belt, near his radio, not threatening but not exactly relaxed either, ready to escalate to physical intervention if this difficult passenger gave them any trouble. Paul launched into his version of events, his voice taking on the aggrieved tone of a reasonable man pushed to his limits by an unreasonable customer. Fraudulent boarding pass passenger refusing to comply with directives, creating a scene and involving other passengers in the disruption. Paul recited his summary, transforming the past 15 minutes into a narrative where he and Felicity were blameless professionals dealing with a problem passenger, where Zara's requests for basic service became demands, her dignity became aggression, her very presence became disruption. Zara opened her mouth to offer her side of the story, but the female security officer held up a hand, a gesture that meant wait, and turned to Paul with a question that gave Zara a flicker of hope that maybe possibly someone in authority might actually care about facts rather than assumptions. "Did you scan the boarding pass?" the female officer asked Paul. Her voice neutral, but the question itself suggesting that she'd identified a gap in his narrative, a step that should have been taken before security was called. Paul faltered for just a moment, his certainty wavering, because the honest answer to that question would reveal that he'd refused to verify the very thing he was claiming was fraudulent, that his entire case against Zara rested on assumption rather than evidence. "I don't need to scan obviously fraudulent documents," Paul said, recovering his authority, doubling down on his original position when the passenger can't provide the required verification. "Credit card, digital confirmation. There's no point in wasting time with." But the female officer interrupted him, her question cutting through his justifications with uncomfortable precision. "With respect, sir," the officer said, and Zara could hear the skepticism underneath the professional courtesy. "If you haven't scanned it, how do you know it's fraudulent?" It was too logical a question, too obvious, a gap in Paul's reasoning, and for a moment he stood there speechless, his authority challenged by someone whose own authority he couldn't simply dismiss, the way he'd dismissed Trevor, or Imani, or Zara herself. Then Felicity jumped in, stepping forward to support her supervisor, her voice tight with defensive irritation. "Because I checked the manifest when she first approached the counter," Felicity insisted, "and her name isn't on the first-class list. Seat 3C is assigned to someone else who's already boarded the aircraft, so there's no point in scanning a pass that we already know is either fake or assigned to someone else." It sounded reasonable the way Felicity said it, logical even, except that it rested on an assumption that she'd checked thoroughly rather than making a snap judgment based on Zara's appearance. And Zara knew with absolute certainty that Felicity had never actually looked for the name Kennedy in the system, had never verified anything beyond her own prejudice. The boarding announcement crackled overhead, the mechanical voice cutting through the tension at the gate to deliver news that made Zara's heart sink even further. "This is the final boarding call for Flight 447 to San Francisco. All remaining passengers should be at the gate. The aircraft door will be closing in 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Zara thought 7 minutes to resolve a situation that should have taken 30 seconds. 7 minutes before she missed the flight that would get her to Stanford in time for the keynote speech she'd spent months preparing. 7 minutes before this petty bureaucratic power play cost her one of the most important professional opportunities of her young career. She checked the time on her dead phone uselessly, the black screen reflecting her own face back at her, and felt the weight of all the decisions that had led to this moment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. She could walk away right now, could get on the plane in seat 34B like Paul and Felicity wanted, could arrive in San Francisco on time and deliver her speech and pretend this had never happened, could swallow one more indignity in a lifetime of swallowed indignities, and move on because fighting back seemed like more trouble than it was worth. But something in the absolute certainty of Paul's contempt and Felicity's smug satisfaction at having successfully defended her gate against an interloper in the way they'd looked at her hoodie and her jeans and decided they knew everything they needed to know about who she was and what she deserved, made Zara plant her feet and straighten her spine and look directly at Paul as she spoke the words that would make everything that followed inevitable. "I'm not boarding until someone scans this pass and confirms I have the right to be here," Zara said, her voice carrying across the gate area with a clarity that surprised even her every word, deliberate and weighted with the kind of quiet power that comes from knowing your worth even when everyone around you is trying to convince you that you're worthless. The male security officer shifted his weight, his hand moving closer to his radio, interpreting her dignified refusal as potential escalation, and Zara saw the situation crystallizing into its final form. Saw the moment when she would either back down or be removed when the story would end with her humiliation, either voluntary or enforced. And she wondered if her mother would be proud of her for standing her ground or disappointed that she was about to miss her speech over a seat assignment. And then, cutting through all the tension and fear and righteous anger like a knife through fog, a voice spoke from behind the crowd of watching passengers. A voice that carried the kind of authority that comes not from a uniform or a badge, but from the absolute certainty of power. A voice that both Paul and Felicity would recognize too late as the sound of their careers ending. Victor Kennedy had been watching the boarding process from his place in the premium line with the distracted attention of someone checking their phone and answering emails while peripherally aware of the normal chaos of air travel. But something had pulled his focus back to the gate counter. Some instinct that came from years of raising a daughter in a world that didn't always see her clearly, and when he finally looked up from his screen and actually processed what he was seeing. His daughter, his Zara, surrounded by security officers and gate agents, her face holding that particular expression of controlled fear that she always wore when the world was being cruel to her. His entire body went rigid with a fury so complete and so controlled that it was almost invisible to anyone who didn't know him well enough to recognize the signs. He'd been in seat 2A in his mind, had already boarded mentally, was reviewing the quarterly reports he'd planned to read during the flight. But now he was moving forward through the premium line with the focused intensity of a missile locked on target. His phone already in his hand, his mind already calculating exactly how many careers were about to end in the next 15 minutes and how thoroughly he was going to dismantle the culture that had made this moment possible. Back on the plane, first-class flight attendant Renee had noticed that seat 3C remained empty, even as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, and she'd mentioned it to the captain during her pre-flight check, a minor anomaly that might indicate a problem at the gate, and the captain had asked her to check with ground crew about the delay since they were already running 8 minutes behind schedule, and corporate was breathing down everyone's neck about on-time departures. Renee had called down to the gate using the cabin phone, and whoever answered had explained in clipped, irritated tones that there was a situation with a passenger that was being handled by the supervisor, which told Renee absolutely nothing except that something was going wrong, and someone was probably getting the short end of the stick, and she'd returned to Victor's seat to let him know there might be a slight delay while they resolved a passenger issue at the gate. Victor had looked up from his Wall Street Journal at that phrase passenger issue because in his experience, that usually meant someone was being treated badly by someone with just enough authority to abuse it, and he'd asked Renee which seat was causing the delay, though he already suspected he knew the answer. Seat 3. C. Sir Renee had confirmed, and Victor had felt his heart drop into his stomach even as his mind was already moving through the implications, because 3C was supposed to be Zara. He'd arranged the upgrade himself through his assistant just yesterday. A small gesture of paternal care disguised as corporate efficiency. And if there was a problem with her boarding, then something had gone terribly wrong in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend, but knew with absolute certainty he was about to fix with extreme prejudice. He'd unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up before Renee could explain that passengers weren't supposed to deplane once they'd boarded his 6'2" frame, and the expression on his face communicating that he wasn't asking for permission. He was informing her of what was about to happen, and she'd stepped aside. Because you didn't work in customer service for 20 years without learning to recognize when someone with real power was about to use it. Victor had walked back up the jet bridge with long strides, his mind already composing the phone calls he was about to make, the terminations he was about to authorize, the complete overhaul of training and culture he was about to mandate, because this wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about every passenger who'd ever been profiled or dismissed or humiliated at a gate by people who'd confused their small authority with the right to judge human worth. He'd emerged from the Diamond Lounge entrance into the gate area and immediately spotted Zara, surrounded by security officers, spotted Paul Grantham with his supervisor badge and his arms crossed in judgment, spotted the whole ugly tableau of institutional prejudice made visible, and something in Victor's chest had cracked open, not with grief this time, but with a cold, precise anger that he'd learned to wield like a surgical instrument in boardrooms and negotiations. The kind of anger that didn't shout, but instead dismantled, that didn't threaten, but instead executed. He'd strode forward through the crowd of watching passengers, his expensive suit, and his commanding presence parting the sea of travelers like Moses at the Red Sea. And when Paul had seen him approaching and made the fatal mistake of assuming he was just another angry passenger, who could be dismissed with the same contempt he'd shown Zara, Victor had watched the man seal his own fate without even knowing it. "What is going on here?" Victor had demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with the kind of authority that comes from actually having power rather than just performing it. And every head in the gate area had turned toward him, recognizing instinctively that the dynamics of the situation had just shifted in ways they couldn't yet fully understand. Paul had looked at Victor and seen another black man, had made his own set of assumptions based on appearance and race, had decided that this was probably the difficult passenger's friend or relative, come to make the situation worse, and he'd responded with the same dismissive contempt he'd been showing Zara, completely failing to recognize that he was standing on the edge of a cliff that was about to crumble beneath him. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," Paul had said, his voice dripping with false patience. "Please board the aircraft and let us handle this situation." Victor had ignored him completely, walking straight to Zara and searching her face for signs of harm, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he asked the question that mattered more than anything else in that moment. "Are you all right?" he'd said, and Zara had nodded, relief flooding her features at his presence, at the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore facing down this particular manifestation of the world's casual cruelty. "Dad, they won't scan my pass." Zara had explained, her voice steady, but Victor could hear the tremor underneath the fear and frustration and exhaustion from 15 minutes of having to defend her basic humanity to people who'd decided she didn't deserve it. Paul had interrupted, still completely oblivious to the magnitude of his mistake, still operating under the assumption that he was dealing with two difficult passengers rather than the man who literally owned the airline he worked for, and the daughter that man would burn down kingdoms to protect. "Dad," Paul had said, and there was a note of mockery in his voice, as if the family connection explained everything, confirmed all his assumptions about entitled passengers who thought their relationships gave them special privileges. "Sir, If this is your daughter, then you can explain to her that fraud is a serious offense, and we take attempts to board with invalid documentation very seriously, and if she continues to be disruptive, we'll have no choice but to deny boarding to both of you and possibly pursue charges for. But Victor had cut him off with a look that could have frozen the sun, his voice dropping to that particular register of quiet fury that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of shouting. Fraud. Victor had repeated tasting the word like it was poison, and something in his tone had finally penetrated Paul's oblivious certainty, had made the supervisor take a half step back, even though he couldn't have articulated what exactly had changed in the atmosphere around them. "My name is Victor Kennedy." Victor had continued each word, falling like a hammer blow. "I'm a passenger in first class on this flight seat, 2A, and this is my daughter Zara Kennedy, who was upgraded to seat 3C through a courtesy upgrade. I personally arranged through my executive assistant yesterday afternoon." He'd paused, letting that information sink in, watching Paul's face begin to process the implications, even as his brain apparently refused to make the final connection that would reveal the true scope of his catastrophic error. Now Victor had said, his voice still quiet but carrying across the entire gate area. "Someone is going to scan her boarding pass and confirm this information, or I'm going to make one phone call that will end several careers in the next 60 seconds. And I want you to understand, Mr. Grantham, that I'm not speaking metaphorically or making empty threats." Paul's face had gone through several colors in rapid succession, confusion, giving way to the first glimmers of real fear. But his ego and his 18 years of unchallenged authority at this gate wouldn't let him back down, wouldn't let him admit that he might have made a mistake, so he doubled down in the way that drowning men sometimes fight the people trying to save them. "Sir, I don't care if you're in first class or who you think you are," Paul had said, his voice rising, slightly compensating for his growing uncertainty with volume. "Threatening employees is grounds for removal from the flight, and if you continue to interfere with my handling of this situation, I'll have security escort both of you out of the terminal." It was the wrong thing to say. The absolutely worst possible thing to say. And Victor had pulled out his phone with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, and wanted everyone present to remember this moment with crystal clarity. He'd pressed a number on his speed dial, the phone ringing exactly once before someone answered on the other end, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority that comes from writing paychecks rather than cashing them. "Miranda." "This is Victor," he'd said, and the gate area had gone so quiet you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. "I'm at O'Hare Terminal 1, Gate C. 14 Skyline Airways. I need you to pull the ownership documents for Skyline and send them to my phone, and I need you to connect me to Janet Reeves immediately." There'd been a pause while his assistant processed this unusual request, and Paul's face had begun to change color again, this time, draining toward an unhealthy gray as the name Janet Reeves registered in his consciousness, because everyone who worked for Skyline Airways knew that name, knew that Janet Reeves was the CEO of the entire airline, the person who could fire or hire or restructure entire divisions with a single email. Felicity had leaned toward Paul and whispered something, her voice urgent, and Paul had hissed back, "The CEO, you idiot," his own voice tight with the dawning realization that maybe possibly he'd made an error in judgment that was about to have consequences he'd never imagined when he'd dismissed Zara's request to scan her boarding pass. The phone had clicked as the call connected, and Victor's expression hadn't changed, his voice remaining calm and professional even as he prepared to systematically destroy the careers of everyone who'd participated in humiliating his daughter. "Janet. It's Victor Kennedy," he'd said, and the use of his full name had been deliberate. A message not just to Janet, but to everyone listening that he was acting in his official capacity as majority shareholder, not as a concerned father, but as the man who controlled 60% of the company's voting shares. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for asking. But I'm currently standing at one of your gates watching your staff attempt to remove my daughter from a flight. she has a confirmed ticket for because they've decided her boarding pass is fraudulent without actually bothering to verify it. There'd been silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that comes from a CEO processing the information that a major shareholder is about to unleash hell on her operation, and Victor had continued before she could formulate a response. The supervisor's name is Paul Grantham, employee ID. I'm looking at his badge right now, 49221, and the gate agent is Felicity Whitmore. I don't have her employee number, but I'm sure you can look it up, and they've called security to remove my daughter for the crime of standing at their counter with a legitimate boarding pass and asking them to do their jobs. Paul had tried to interrupt, his voice rising with desperation. Mr. Kennedy, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. But Victor had held up one finger in exactly the same dismissive gesture Felicity had used on Zara earlier, the parallel so perfect it would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating, and Paul had fallen silent like he'd been slapped. Victor had continued speaking to Janet Reeves, his voice never rising above conversational volume but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I'm aware of the fraud prevention protocols, Janet. I approved the budget for them last quarter. But this isn't fraud prevention. This is profiling, and we both know the difference, even if your gate staff apparently doesn't. Another pause while Janet said something on her end, and Victor's expression had hardened further. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in private apologies or quiet resolutions. This happened in public in front of dozens of witnesses, some of whom are currently recording this interaction on their phones, and it's going to be resolved in public with full accountability for everyone involved. Victor had lowered the phone slightly and addressed Paul directly, his voice carrying across the gate area to every passenger who was watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold. The CEO is calling you in approximately 30 seconds. Mr. Grantham. Victor had said, the statement delivered as simple fact rather than threat. I suggest you answer when she does, and I suggest you listen very carefully to what she tells you, because your career at this company is currently hanging by a thread that's getting thinner with every second you continue to stand there instead of doing what my daughter asked you to do 15 minutes ago, which was scan her boarding pass and verify her seat assignment. Paul's radio had crackled to life at that exact moment, the timing so perfect it almost seemed staged. A voice from the command center saying, Paul Grantham, pick up line 3, immediately, urgent call from executive level. Paul's hand had trembled as he'd reached for the desk phone, his fingers fumbling with the receiver, and everyone in the gate area had watched him lift it to his ear with the expression of a man who knew he was about to hear the words that would end everything he'd built over 18 years of service. This is Paul Grantham, he'd said into the phone, his voice barely above a whisper. And then everyone had watched his face cycle through every stage of grief in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, as Janet Reeves had apparently explained to him in very clear terms exactly who Victor Kennedy was, what authority he held, and what was about to happen to Paul's career and pension and future employment prospects if he didn't immediately fix the situation he'd created through his combination of prejudice and incompetence. The color had drained completely from Paul's face, leaving him looking like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet, and when he'd finally hung up the phone, his hand had been shaking so badly the receiver had clattered against the cradle twice before he'd managed to place it properly. He'd looked at Felicity with the expression of someone who'd just been told they had a terminal illness, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier authority, all its swagger and certainty reduced to the thin, desperate whisper of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. Scan her pass, Paul had said to Felicity, the words coming out strangled and defeated, and Felicity had stared at him like he'd lost his mind, like he'd forgotten everything they'd just spent the past 15 minutes establishing about this passenger's fraudulent attempt to access first class. But You said Felicity had started to protest, still not understanding that the rules of the game had changed, that the authority they'd been wielding had been revealed as borrowed and conditional subject to being revoked by people with real power who'd finally noticed what was being done in their names. Scan the damn pass. Paul had shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, all pretense of professional composure abandoned in the face of his impending termination, and Felicity had finally registered that something fundamental had shifted, that Paul was terrified in a way she'd never seen him before, and whatever was happening was serious enough that following his original instructions was no longer an option. Felicity's hands had shaken uncontrollably as she'd picked up the scanner, as she'd reached for Zara's boarding pass, with fingers that could barely maintain their grip. And when Zara had tapped her phone, suddenly alive again, Victor having apparently handed her his portable battery pack to charge it against the scanner, the computer had beeped with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire terminal, a single electronic confirmation that would be the last thing Felicity heard in her career as a Skyline Airways gate agent. The printer had whirred to life, spitting out a boarding pass receipt that confirmed everything Zara had been trying to tell them for the past 15 minutes, and Felicity had stared at the printout like it was written in a language she couldn't understand, the reality of her catastrophic error finally penetrating the armor of her certainty. Kennedy Zara. The receipt had read Seat 3C. First class confirmed priority. Boarding courtesy upgrade authorized by V. Kennedy executive level. The silence that followed had been absolute and crushing, broken only by the sound of Felicity's breathing as it transformed into something that sounded like she was drowning in air, her face crumpling as the tears started, and the reality of what she'd done and what it was going to cost her finally became impossible to deny.